Today we are hanging out to discuss some of the changes that happened to Gmail and your response to those changes. We got a number of really good questions about the changes to Gmail over the past year, and so we wanted to take the time to try to answer those. There were some questions that came up multiple times, and so rather than going straight down the list, we're going to kind of address those questions thematically, but we should still be able to cover most of the top 20 questions. In the Hangout today, we have Mark, who is the Engineering Director for Gmail.
Hi.
And we also have Brett, who is VKP 56 in our forum. So thank you both for joining us. So the first question that was at the top of the list of questions is about trimming signatures. Brett, do you maybe want to explain that question a little bit?
Okay, so there were actually two questions. The number one question was, please stop trimming signatures. Nobody asked for it, and it's counterproductive to readability. Just revert to the previous show hide quoted behavior. And then similarly, question 9 was about, I put useful information in my signature, and it goes on to say that they really want that information to be seen by the people they're sending it to.
Okay. Yeah, so one trend in general that we see on Gmail is that conversations become shorter, that it's not long conversations with long paragraphs and people quoting, but it's fairly short conversations. And whenever we do user research and user studies, signatures in these shorter conversations really get in the way, because there's like one line of text and then there's a couple of lines of signature, another line of text that responds, a couple of lines of signatures. And what we try to do in Gmail is to really show conversations as real conversations where people talk to each other. And so that's why we got more aggressive in trimming signatures. That's also why we took a lot of the boilerplate code at the top out that you normally saw in the conversations, where you see the message header and all kinds of information. We're hiding this now too, again, to focus the conversation on the actual content, on the conversation that actually happens between people.
What are the actual changes that were done when we went from the old show hide to the new trimming? Was it more aggressive, as you mentioned, or what else actually changed between those two methods?
The main thing that we changed was really signature trimming. In the old model, we would show the signature in the first post, and then in almost all cases, the signature, when the email gets sent around, would then fall under quoted text and wouldn't be shown anywhere. So the main change really is that the signature doesn't show up in the first couple of messages, and then sometimes accidentally it would show up later. And as I said, with that, we also took out some of our own information that we put at the top about the email that was sent. All this header stuff that is in the email where we were showing something previously, and now we took almost everything out, and we're also hiding it now under a small button where people can then see the entire header and everything that is in there.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the signature trimming only seen in Gmail? That is, if you're using another service provider, or if you're using an email client or anything else, you still see the entire message?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. This is really just a display functionality. So we have never and will never touch the emails itself and actually change them. So if people use IMAP or any other type of client to read email, they will see the exact email as it was sent, and then those clients might do their own display logic. So yeah, it's really just a display logic where we change how we display the email in Gmail itself, but we don't touch the actual content.
Okay, one last follow-up question here. Some people have complained about how the ... is almost hidden. And I was wondering, would there be any way to make that a little more visible, a little more obvious, maybe using up-down arrows the way the expand collapse icon works, just to make it a little more, give a better indication that there's something there?
Yeah, so what we tried to do was that we have different icons for sort of different places where you can show and hide information. And what we try to do is that we now use one icon always in the conversations to reveal more information. And so that's the ... And so that's why we chose a different icon there, because we didn't want to have the same icon for hide and show or disclose information in various places of the UI where it actually means different things. And so what we want to do is that people get used to, this is the place, the ... where you can see more information about the actual content of the mail and not some other information, the header or any other things.
I just wanted to ask, when we were talking about display a second ago, that kind of raises the point to me of the difference between what the sender is doing and wanting and what the recipient is doing and wanting, because we hear a little bit of both. We hear some recipients who want to see the signatures, but mostly we hear senders who want to make sure their signatures get seen. And Mark, I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, so what we see in user studies that usually senders want others to see their signature, and we see receivers most of the time saying like, yeah, I don't want to see these signatures. If I want to see the signature, I want to go in there and it's fine, but by default, I really don't want to see them. And so that's, if we were to change something there, we would probably monitor how people use it, and if we see that people actually look at signatures quite a lot, then we might implement some functionality to either automatically detect that, and for people who look at signatures, show it automatically, or maybe then go the way that we really try hard not to do, is to create another setting that says, show me the signatures from emails. But it's important for us that we would put the control over this on the receiver side and not on the sender side. Thanks, Mark. And just to clarify, that's the kind of things that we would look at, not necessarily something that's happening right now. Yeah, exactly. It's not something. Again, these are some of the things that we monitor on an ongoing basis to see how people interact and use Gmail. And if we see that people really use this a lot to look at signatures a lot, then we would definitely react to it. Thanks. So let's move on to the next topic. There were a bunch of questions about contrast and colors. Brett, maybe if you want to give a quick overview of those questions.
Okay, the question number 2 in the ranking was, is there any plan to allow users to change the color of the font to address the still prevailing contrast and readability issues? And then there were 2 other questions, 13 and 17, that both dealt with the light gray versus dark gray on buttons and text and background, and just generally contrast issues on that. Basically, users want more control over the fonts and colors that are used, similar to the fully customized themes that were available previously. Yeah. So I think it's important to separate these 2 issues. There's on one side the issue that people want to customize the UI just to their own liking, and then the issue of having high contrast themes for people with visual impairments who have problems with the style that we have. So let me first answer the second one, actually. So the high contrast themes that we created were exactly for this reason, that we realized that with the themes that we had, the different themes, that it wasn't enough for people to actually get high enough contrast if they have visual impairments. And so that's why we've developed these 2 high contrast themes with like black on light gray, to really provide 2 themes, a dark and a light one, for people to get the highest possible contrast, to being able to read and see everything fairly easy. And this is a good example. This is one of the features that was developed after we started testing the new look internally at Google. And at Google, being such a large company, we have some people who have problems seeing, and they came back to us and says, like, look, from the existing themes and the existing customizability, we can't use it. We need something else. That's why we developed the high contrast themes. Now the other part was, why can't people customize the UI more as it was before, where you could customize individual fonts, individual colors? And the reason there is really that the customizability in the old look put a really, really high tax on us to develop and to test Gmail, and it resulted quite often into user visible issues where we created new features and then we forgot, and I'm really using some real life examples, to test the beach theme at some point in the afternoon, because some of these themes change during the day, and so suddenly a text that we put somewhere, a new element that we put somewhere, was suddenly at a certain time of the day
invisible because the background color changed. And so this is why we went back to the drawing board and says, okay, how can we provide customizability, that it is important for people to have Gmail look like their own, without creating all the complexity that slows us down in developing and testing, and that even creates issues for our users. And that's why we came up with the idea of keeping the UI elements basically the same, creating two versions of these, the light and the dark version, and then allowing people to put pictures behind it. And first we had the pictures that we provided, and then we recently added the functionality that people now can choose their own picture, so to put anything behind it, behind their Gmail that they want to see. And one issue that came then up afterwards, that many people says, yeah, overall this is good, but in the actual content where I really read my email, there it's distracting that I see too much of the background picture. And this was one of the changes where we said, yeah, we make that part more opaque, that it's not so much distracting. This is the part where people don't want to have much customizability or many different colors. That's where they just want to read the content and read what the other person sent us. So this is an area that we changed afterwards to stay within what we had in mind with customizing with background pictures, but improving the usability of it.
Are there any options available to people who just really feel they need more control over the look for maybe more serious visual impairment, or perhaps some colorblind issues or something where they just really feel they need something more?
I mean, from everything that we know, again, for people with visual impairments, colorblind, or people whose eyes are not that good, and there we have these two themes that, I mean, there we did a lot of research, and there's a lot of standards out there, like black on light gray. It's just the best contrast we can provide on a computer display. So I think on that side, we have UIs that do work for everybody. Again, for people who just want to have much more customizability, creating some colors, not for readability, but just because it's their own liking, by default, no, there is nothing planned to support that. And some people then do things that they install Google Chrome extensions or create their own style sheets that they put over this to do this. So it's a very technical approach, and it's a kind of a brittle approach, because if we change the UI or if we change our style sheets a lot, then these things might break. But this is something that some very tech-savvy people did. And it's not something, again, that we want to put into the product, because it would put, again, the burden on us to make sure that these things never break with all the features and everything that we have.
Yeah, there are a few people that put a lot of work into the use of user styles and have done some pretty impressive things, but it is unsupported, so they do have some slight risk there.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, it's not that we change our style sheet every week. I mean, for the most part, the UI, I mean, the sort of grand scheme of the UI in Gmail is pretty stable. I mean, we add new features, but it's not that we change the layout. I mean, this UI change was by far the biggest change we ever made to the product, and it's not something that we intend to do every year again or every other year again.
Cool. Well, let's move on to the next question, which is more of a meta question around people who are not satisfied with the changes that we made. Brett, can you maybe shed some light on that one?
Okay, this was question 3 in the ranking. The Gmail forums and other websites demonstrate that many users are not satisfied with the direction that the new look is taking Gmail. How does Google plan to address that dissatisfaction, and how will that affect future changes to Gmail? Now, this isn't just about what new improvements might be coming, but it's also about the overall vision of usability in Gmail for the future.
Yeah. So let me answer this a little bit longer. And what I first want to describe is, how do we get, like the Gmail team at Google, how do we get feedback? How do we know if changes that we make to Gmail make users happy or unhappy, people can use the product or can't use the product? And there's two very different ways that we use. The first one is just simple metrics. I mean, we see how many people sign up for Gmail. We see how many people use Gmail. We see how many people use Gmail daily, once a week, once a month. We know how many emails people send and receive. And so out of all this, we get a very good idea for these 400 million and more users that we have now, how they use Gmail overall. And so these are signals for us that we check quite often and that we take as a signal if we see that there is a drop in, let's say, messages sent, or that there is a drop in how many people log in, or how often people log in, or how much people use Gmail. These are signals if we see that there's issues, and we monitor these like globally or even regionally to then see, okay, maybe we have a problem in the product, and sometimes we find out, oh, we have a problem in the product in just a particular language or in a particular browser, where we see some of these metrics going the wrong way. So this is where we get a really good feeling and information about the health of the product overall. And then we have forums, Google+, and other outlets where we get very specific feedback from individual users. And from these channels, we mostly benefit from it by actually having the ability to discuss with people, to brainstorm with people if we have an issue, how could we solve it. Sometimes by just following discussions, it's very valuable for us. So even if we don't participate, we can see what people do discuss and what solutions or what changes people discuss. So on that channel, we get more what I would call qualitative information, not the quantitative, the health of the product, but the qualitative, how can we change, or what is it that people really annoys when we see there is a drop in, let's say, engagement of people, looking into these forums or sometimes actively engaging in forums and trying to get a feeling, okay, what has changed that this happened? And so with the UI change that we made in Gmail, of course, this was crucially important for us. Measuring and following all these metrics that we have to make sure that none of the changes that we made reduce how many people use Gmail and how people use Gmail. And so one thing that I want to do is I actually want to share two graphs of the many graphs that we have that show the health of Gmail. Let me do this. I have this here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes.
So the first graph here is the user growth of Gmail over the last 1.5 years. And again, this is one of the most important metrics for us. How many people use Gmail and what is the user growth? And the two numbers that you see there are two of the numbers that we published in the last couple of months. At the end of last year, Gmail had 350 million users, and just recently at Google I/O, we told people that now we have 425 million active users. So these are users that actively use Gmail. And so one thing that's very clear from this graph, the new look didn't really have any impact on user growth. Like as many as people sign up to Gmail and become active users before and after the new UI. And so again,
hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, can you explain that real fast? So let's say that somebody stopped using Gmail because they didn't like the new look. When you say active users, what does that mean as far as this graph?
Yeah, so these would be people that basically drop out of this graph. So if we had a vast, like lots of users, a couple of million users who would stop using Gmail and would use something else, we would see that in this graph very clearly. And yeah, because this is really active users. Again, people who log in actively use Gmail to read and send email. And so this is the first graph. Again, one of the most important graphs that we have that just shows us the product is healthy and successful. Existing users keep using the product, and new users sign up with the same rate or even higher than before. And then the other graph that I want to share is what we call our user happiness graph. So this is a survey that we constantly run within Gmail, where people can give us feedback and where we ask people, how happy are you with Gmail? How satisfied are you with Gmail? And it's a scale of, oh God, Sarah, you have to help me. I think it's 1 to 6.
It might be even 1 to 7.
1 to 7. And so what we see here is this is the percentage of people that are happy with Gmail, that are satisfied with Gmail, and say it's a good service that we provide. And first of all, this graph, even within Google, the numbers that I had to take out here, but the numbers on this graph are extremely high even for Google. So Gmail is a product that users really, really like. much, much more than they like other products, even within Google. And so when we look at this graph now with the new UI, I have these 3 vertical lines in here. When did we launch the opt-in of the new UI, where people could voluntarily opt in? When did we launch that we opted every in, but let people the ability to opt out? And when did we make the new UI final and there wasn't any way to get back to the old UI? And so one thing that we see is that user happiness dropped when we launched the opt-in of the new UI. And to some degree, that is expected. If people use something like Gmail so often and as much as people use Gmail, any change that we make confuses people, and there's the initial reaction of like, oh, I like it a little bit less. This is something that we saw in our own user studies when we gave it to people, that the initial reaction was like, wow, it takes me a little bit longer to do something just because it's different. But what we then saw is that after a while, it goes back to the level where it was before. And the more remarkable change was then actually when we opted everybody into the new UI and people could voluntarily opt out, that there wasn't any drop. That was the second vertical line. So after we made everybody use the UI and a couple of people then opted out again, there wasn't any drop. So people used the new UI and there wasn't any change. And then what we can see here is then we made the new UI finally final. And after we made this, our user happiness numbers basically came back a few months later, that they're now back pretty much to the level where they were before. And so these are 2 of the examples that we have, or 2 of the examples that I want to give, how we monitor if Gmail as a product is healthy or not. Let me take this out that you can see me again. And so coming back then to the original question, so when we see these comments in forums that people are unhappy, again, we can't use these comments as, oh my God, there is something wrong with Gmail. We have to evaluate the health of Gmail with these numbers, how people do interact, how people use Gmail. And if we see that people use Gmail as much as good as before, then it's a signal for us that overall the product is really healthy and features that we launch have no impact or have a positive impact. If we see that features that we launch have a negative impact on any of these metrics, this is where we then, okay, now we really have to do something because we did something to the product that a significant number of users find detrimental.
Mark, you mentioned features having no impact, and that line there looked relatively flat. Would you have expected the line to increase for any reason or fluctuate otherwise?
I did not expect that the new UI initially would make people happier with Gmail. As I said, there is the initial reaction. We had this ourselves. I mean, we had this even within the Gmail team when we tried it. We had this within Google. A tool that you use as much as Gmail and as personal as Gmail. Again, it's not public search. It's really your own email, your own content, your own life that's in there. People find it distracting if things change too much. And we have these drops in happiness with other features that we launch, sometimes features that might not even affect many people or that people could almost ignore. We see that even that changes happiness. So we certainly did not expect this graph to go up, but this is basically the desired and best expected outcome that we have, that it drops a little bit. People find it irritating when they have to use it first, but then it goes back up after a while. And it's also something to keep in mind for the new look. The new look was really, for us, to allow people to use products across Google much better. So if people use Docs and they then start using Gmail, that the UI, the colors, the icons, everything doesn't look totally different, but it looks very similar. Or if people come new to Google and use it for the first time, to have a UI that is much, much simpler, where we removed a lot of the complexity of the UI by hiding the buttons when they're not active or when they're not useful. So these are the people that benefit from this change, but the vast majority of users, because Gmail is so big in numbers compared to our other Google products, that's why these numbers sort of are not reflected in these graphs.
Now, some forum posters feel that a significant measure of satisfaction would be a measure of how many people tried the new look in the opt-in and then switched back, or people during the opt-out period used it to opt out? How many people went into the new look and then said, get me out of here, and went back again? Are there any numbers you can share about that?
Unfortunately, I can't share the numbers, but it's right. That was pretty much our top metric that we were watching when we did these two things. When we launched the opt-in to see how many people opt in and then opt back out, and when we then launched the opt-in and then people opted out by themselves again. These were two of the most important metrics to watch, and they were below the thresholds that we set ourselves. So we said if it's above this, then we have to do something else. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't change the numbers, but we set them fairly conservatively. And these were also numbers, I think it came up in the forum where somebody says, or where somebody alluded to, like, who is measuring this or who is observing this? Like, these are numbers that we had to report within Google to our SVPs and to others. They were very interested in this, and they were partially concerned, how will this new look affect usability and the success of the product? So these were some numbers that we had to report internally because we said this is one of our success criteria here.
Brett, did you have any other follow-up questions on that topic?
I think we can move on.
Okay. Well, the next set of questions involve the usability of the conversation view, and I think there are a whole bunch of different questions here that we thought it made sense to group together. Brett, if you want to go over those questions.
Actually, there's one before the conversation view. It was question number 4 in the ranking, and it says, what testing has been done to determine if the newest UI has made using the product faster, and what were the results of these tests? And this is specifically asking about the speed of execution of the new look versus the old. For example, when you click on Compose or open a label, is that action physically faster or slower than it was before?
Okay. So yeah, let me first describe sort of high level the process that we went through with this change, but with many other user visible changes that we make in Gmail and basically across Google. So so for the new look, again, there was a lot of research and design going on first across Google to figure out what is the new Google look that we want to apply to all our products. And this is where many of the Gmail UI designers were involved, because Gmail is such an important product, to make sure that whatever we designed for all of Google would work for Gmail. Out of this, we basically created sort of a general style guide, and then we try to apply this to Gmail. And what we do then is that we create what we call functional mocks very, very quickly. So not just a mock where we can see this is how it would look like, but it's a static sort of HTML page. But it's something where you can actually click, things happen, dialog boxes power up, conversation views show up, you can expand and collapse and everything. We create these very quickly for us to first test it, and then we actually do the first user studies with them, where we invite users and say, look, try this, and where we give users sort of fairly high-level tasks. How would you send an email? Or you got an email from your friend last week, how would you find it? So where we give people fairly generic tasks. And so what we try to find out with these user studies is, can people actually use the new features or the new look in this case? Or do people struggle at some point? Can't they find a button? Can't they understand something? So this is the very first step. And there are usually some iterations to improve it. Once we convinced ourselves that we now have a look and a UI that can be used, then we try to implement it very, very fast. Just the bare minimums, not all the features, not all the bells and whistles. And we then start within the Gmail team using the new UI on our own Gmail accounts very quickly. So that we now, day in, day out, when we are at Google, when we use Gmail at Google, that we use the new look or the new features. And we interact with it. We can see, we get numbers if it's faster, if it's slower. We can see ourselves. Does it work for me? Are there any problems? This is then where we iterate a lot over it, where we make changes, and where we then implement everything else. Once we have it now implemented, that we say, okay, now it's really at the point where we can use it, where we see that some numbers that we collect internally, again, things like latency, transition latency from the inbox to the conversation view, or these things. When we say, okay, these numbers are good, then we start doing two things. We first do what we call internal dog food, where we now enable this feature, or the new UI in this case, for all the people who work at Google. And so what we test out there is, on one side, that's then the point where we have the whole transition in, where we get sort of a splash page that explains a new feature, how people can enable it, how people can disable it. So we really let all the Googlers run through the sign-up flow, or to the opt-out flow in this case, if they choose to. And that's where we get a lot of feedback. And if I say a lot of feedback, Sarah remembers this, Googlers are not shy. Googlers give a lot of feedback, and a lot of direct feedback. And so we did this within Google, and again, we got feedback. Again, the high contrast themes was one of the many things that came out. And many, many other things where people tried to use it, they couldn't use it for their use case, for this use case. And the one feedback that we get specifically out of this is, how fast can people use Gmail? Because at Google, I mean, we always see this when we compare sort of different user groups. When we compare the average Gmail user, which might be here, then we have the sort of power users, they might be here, and then we have Googlers that are somewhere in the next room. Like, people at Google get so much email and interact so much email, spend so much time on email, that they need the UI of Gmail and the whole flow of Gmail as fast and as efficient as possible. And that's where we actually got a lot of feedback from some people who, again, monitor our production services, for example. And they said, like, look, I have all these tickets coming in, I have these escalations to follow, I can't do this and this and this anymore. And so this was very, very valuable feedback. And in fact, the internal feedback that we got was so much that this actually delayed the whole launch of the new UI. Because we felt that it's important to implement all this and then to do another round where we then ask everybody at Google, especially the people who opted out at Google, to say, like, look, after a while, use this new UI again. We addressed all of the issues that we had tried out again. And that's where we also measured then things, okay, how many people tried out, how many people opt out again, to keep this below a certain threshold. The other thing that we then do in parallel is that we then do user studies, but now we can do user studies on people's real inboxes. So we don't have to give them an artificial inbox, but we can basically give them the new UI. And that's where we then do longer-term user studies, not just an hour or 2 hours to see if they can execute the basic functionality, but really give them the new UI, do user studies, and then do a couple of follow-up surveys to ask them, how does the new UI feel? Do you think you can use it as fast as before? And so this is then where we get feedback from individual users. What might still be wrong? Or is it actually good enough that people can use it? And again, after this hump that we get, or after this drop that we get with such a change, does the happiness and does the efficiency come back up? And so this is then everything that we do before we do the launch. And then in this case, we decided we launch this change now first as an opt-in. We then monitor our opt-in and opt-out rate, then as an opt-out, and then the final launch. So these were all the stages, all the different tests that we do to move this new design from one step to the next, to making sure that we come out with something once we go to everybody, that we then have a product and a UI that's as efficient and as good as possible. And so as I said, like the one aspect that you alluded to, like, is the new UI as fast or even faster than the old one? And as I said, like, the one piece that we get from Googlers is they can use it, like buttons, how they show up, where they are. We get the feedback very directly if we introduce unnecessary clicks where people say, look, I could use this before like this, now I have to do all these other things. So things that we might have missed, that's where we get that feedback. The other thing, and again, I don't have metrics for these, or I don't have graphs for these, I can't share them. The UI itself, so the loading times of the various stages and the various pages of the UI actually became faster with the new look. And the main reason is that with the new look, we actually deprecated support for some of the older browsers like IE6. So we could actually finally use some of the newer HTML5 constructs and elements that allow us to make the UI faster. So one thing that we could see is when we launched the new look, and after that, when we made more and more changes, we actually improved the latency of Gmail by a significant amount.
Okay, you kind of already answered one of my follow-up questions about how fast can people complete tasks, and you sort of addressed that one. But another question I had is, how does the experience of learning the new look compare for experienced people who use the old look versus those who have never seen the old look and are just trying to learn the product for the first time on the new look? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So there we did a bunch of user studies, not to the extent that we got like metrics from, let's say, millions of people, but that's where the user studies were really helpful, that we had now people who use Gmail for the first time, or where we had people who used Gmail before, and where we then again monitored, sometimes even with eye-tracking cameras, very closely, what is the initial experience? Do people find it disturbing? Do people look around a lot on the screen? Do people take a lot of time to find a button or to execute something? Or do people basically can do the basic tasks and can continue with what they're doing? And so that's where we got the feedback that, yeah, the new UI is definitely a good UI to learn Gmail, and even for people who used to know Gmail, after a while, they can go back to the level where they were before.
Okay, well, now let's go ahead and move on to those conversation view themed questions. Sorry about that, I skipped the line there. And I think, we've been taking a lot of time on all these questions so far, and I know there's still a lot more to go through, so maybe we can, I think from here on out, we should be able to address some of the major themes a little bit more quickly, just because they're a little bit less complicated questions.
Okay.
So, Brett, do you want to go ahead into the conversation question?
Yeah, so the next set of questions all deal with the usability of the conversation view. Question 5 was, the color coding of names in conversations was a useful feature of the old look. So useful that the help forums use that. For product consistency, shouldn't it be restored to the new look in Gmail? Another question, number 6, why is disabling avatars not an option? Many contacts have blank avatars, and this is wasted space. And then there were 3 other questions, 11, 12, and 16, that all dealt with the dividing lines and separators, both in the conversation view and on the main page, that helped to compartmentalize the information a little bit better. So a whole bunch of things about conversation view.
Yeah. So the one thing that we tried with the new look was to get away from the kind of boxy UI design that we had before, where we had like horizontal and vertical lines a lot in the product to differentiate different sections, one mail from the other, one conversation or one message from the other in the conversation view. What we tried with the new look, and that's again something that we did across all of Google, to make it a little less boxed in, a little bit, the word that the UI designers chose quite often, a little bit more airy, a little lighter than it was before. And so what we did with the conversation views, that's why we brought these avatars more prominently in, and the pictures. We try to have the conversation view kind of, the UI designers described it kind of like a bulleted list, where you have the picture from each person at the beginning. And so through this, you can then now basically see, oh, here's where one message starts, here's where the next message starts, here's where the next message starts. And this is something that we did a lot in our usability studies. Again, with eye-tracking cameras, do people find it distracting or not? Do people understand where they read one line and then the next line? And so we tried overall to take out all these sort of visible elements that we had, all these dividers, make it a little bit more lightweight. And that's where the avatars came in very importantly, to say, look, in the end, it's a conversation between people. So we want to make sure that instead of seeing colors, you actually see a picture of a person. And the picture of a person has also another nice side effect, that if I now have a conversation with Sarah, I always see Sarah. I don't see in one conversation Sarah with the green color, in the next conversation Sarah with the red color. It's always, this is a reply from Sarah. It always looks the same. And so with the avatars, what we had to do there is we had to put these images, these profile pictures, more into the product to make them more prominent, that people actually use pictures themselves more. In the past, we didn't use these pictures a lot, so there was very little incentive or very little reason to actually upload a picture. And so we had the situation that we know we can make Gmail much better if people have pictures, but we don't have many pictures. And so we put them more in now, and use this as an incentive that people actually upload pictures. Now that people say, wow, it becomes much more interesting, much more important to have a picture. And so if we don't have a picture, now we show the avatar, but now with a slight color coding, that we sort of have a mix between two. The old way of color coding things, but the new way of showing, like, look, if you would upload a picture here, it would look even better. It wouldn't just be this shadow person with a slight greenish or bluish hue.
Okay. Personally, I have a slight preference for the color coding, but I may be in a minority on that, so we can probably move on.
Well, and do you feel like we answered all the questions about the lines as well too? I know, Mark, we made some of those lines darker, didn't we?
Yeah, and that's then one thing that we did. Once we did user studies and feedback and everything, that we took a couple of lines and made them just slightly darker. And again, these are then tricky processes or tricky adjustments to do, because these are again style guides across all of Google. So what we then try to do is make these adjustments that again, Gmail doesn't start looking different from the other products. And so that's why we made a couple of these small adjustments. So we said, okay, in the end, it's not too distracting from this effect. You go from Gmail to Docs and it looks the same, but it helps actually Gmail users. Yeah, so some of the vertical lines we accentuated a little bit more when we saw and got the feedback and could see it from our user studies that, yeah, there is not enough division between elements.
I guess one question that will come up on this is why don't we just make it a setting?
So that's something that's something that I get pretty much all the time. Every change that we make in Gmail, people would like to have a setting. And so the two things that happen with it, our settings page is already, I would call it out of bounds. It's a lot of customizability that we can see most people never use and don't understand where everything is because it's so many settings. And the second part is, again, making everything a setting increases the complexity of the product a lot. So to develop, to test, to roll things out, because now we have to test all these different combinations of this with this. So what we rather try to do is develop, again, a style in this case that works for the vast majority of users where we actually don't have to make it a setting. Every now and then, we choose to still make things a setting. One of the examples is the icons versus the text on the buttons. And again, the icons are really, really important to create a consistent look and feel across all of Google. You don't want to have a different text from Google Drive to Docs to Gmail to other products. With the icons, we had the chance to make similar actions look exactly the same. But this is where we then, again, monitored feedback, monitored how people use the product, and that's where we could see, okay, some people actually struggled with it. Some people, even after a while, still, they could do what they needed to do, but it took them longer than before, where they were like always looking like, is this icon this or is it this? So that's one of the parts where we actually made it in a setting that now people could actually easily set it as a string or as an icon.
Well, speaking of those icons, there were a couple questions about our decision to not show those icons unless you've opened a message or selected a message. Brett, do you want to elaborate on those questions?
Yeah. Question 7 in the ranking was that the disappearing buttons are not popular with Gmail users. How come your usability testing didn't catch that? And then question 8 is similar about what's the justification for the buttons coming and going. And this behavior would seem to be contrary to standards in use for like menus and dialogues where options that aren't available are grayed out. And so the question is kind of, why don't you do something different than having the buttons bouncing around?
Yeah. And yeah, so this goes back to what I said earlier, that novice users or people who don't use Gmail a lot, for those users, Gmail over the years became very, very complex. Lots of options, links, colors, and everything in there. And so what we try to do with this new look to make it much easier to use Gmail. Pretty much you only have the necessary functions and the really, really important functions. That's where we can use colors now. Composing, sending, searching, that's where we actually use then color to accentuate these. That people who just want to do the basic functionality, I want to send an email, you can do it with color-coded buttons now. This is the basic functionality. Then we have the other buttons. And then we had a lot of these buttons that, again, when you clicked on them, you were told quite often, oh, you haven't selected anything, so the button doesn't do anything. And so what we did there is to try to make the UI as low complex as possible so that people don't have to figure out, can I click this button or not? And that's why we chose the approach to not even show the buttons, because even if we show it, for people, again, who don't use Gmail that frequently, they still see the button and they still have to think, hey, can I use this button or do I do this? Right now, the buttons that you see, you can actually use. You will never click on a button that then tells you, oh, you can't. And so even having them grayed out is still not enough. The button is still there, and people, again, who are not day-to-day users or users who use Gmail a couple of hours a day, they still see them and they still get distracted by it. And there's a lot of usability study going on where you can see if people have too many options, even if the options are not really valid, it takes people longer and longer to make a decision and to do something. I think it's called Hicks' Law. That is one of the studies or one of the fundamental studies that was done there. And so that basically says if there are more and more options, it takes people longer and longer to make a decision and to take an action. And so that's why we decided to actually show the buttons only when they can be used. And that's something that we also ran through our usability study. The good thing is that, again, it's not too many buttons that we actually hide and show. It's not too many elements to do that. And these elements show up at the same place all the time. So if I now select an email, I know after a while exactly where the button to archive this email or something is. I know where this button is, even if it doesn't show up all the time. And so for the usability for people who use these actions quite a lot, they will still be able to use. And that's something that we found out through our usability studies, that people after a while, again, they don't get distracted by it, oh, sometimes the button is there or not. When the button is there, when the button is usable, it's there, and it's always at the same place. So we try to find the balance here. On one side, to make the UI much simpler and much easier to use and less complex for novice or non-power users. At the same time, keeping all the functionality without additional clicks. That was important for us. Without additional clicks available to our power users.
Mark, I know you mentioned this decision-making process becomes longer when there are more options, and I know Brett had mentioned the standard of graying out buttons.
Yeah.
I believe we talked earlier, you and I, with the UI designer about the process of incremental reveal now becoming more standard too.
Yeah. And it's something, I don't think that we set a standard there, but more and more products on the web or in general use this approach to actually don't even show disabled buttons or show buttons as disabled, but don't show them at all. Just because it is still confusing, people still read them, but try to keep UIs as simple as possible.
Okay, well, there's a question about another button, which is the sign out button. Brett, do you want to explain that question?
Yeah, this is question 10 in the ranking. Why has the sign out button been hidden, and will it be brought back for the safety of users? This is a pretty heated topic at some circles. People feel that by hiding the link, Google is discouraging people from signing out, thus reducing account security.
Yeah. So this is also something, again, this was a Google-wide change. And again, this was also something where we monitored very closely which actions in our UIs, not just in Gmail, but across Google, people do a lot. And so everything that people do a lot, we wanted to make sure is really there, is very visible. The sign out button is just something that we saw. Many people don't sign out because most people use Gmail on a computer that they constantly use, and most people know if I leave my computer, I have to take an explicit action anyway. Sign out is not something, or doesn't seem to be something where people sort of see like, hey, there's the sign out button, I should sign out. People who want to sign out because they're on a public computer or they do it all the time, they will do it even if it's sort of one click behind another action. So that's, again, one thing that we took out to make the UI simpler, but leaving it in there, and for people who want to sign out, it's still as accessible as it was before. And again, it's also something that is a trend on the web that we see more and more, that sites don't make sign out such a prevalent option, because in the end, if I sign out, then a couple of minutes later I want to sign back in, I have to sign back in. Again, people who want to sign out, for who it's important, it's always available, and then it's fairly easily accessible. But it's not something that we feel is good for the users to constantly do it and to have as the primary action on the page.
I know I've seen with other web accounts that I have with other services, a lot of them do have the sign out under that profile picture, and I'm guessing they probably have seen the same thing we have, that people, just the way people use the sign out, you know, yeah, that they don't, maybe sometimes even in cases where they should, that showing it doesn't actually help, and that people who do want to sign out will still find it.
Yeah,
Okay. There's some questions about the scroll bars. Brett, do you want to explain what those questions are?
Yeah, there were three different questions about scroll bars, each in sort of a different context. And we're running low on time, so I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to summarize. Question 14 had to do with the scroll bars tending to come and go in the left-hand column depending on what you're doing over there. Question 15 was concerning that in Chrome, the arrow buttons are missing from the scroll bars, and all you can do is drag the bar. You can't get that fine-tuning of the arrow buttons. Question 20 was about why are there so many different scroll bars, talking about sometimes there can be a scroll bar for the browser, there'll be a scroll bar for the conversation, there might be a scroll bar in the field where you're editing your reply. And if there's a wide post, there could be a horizontal scroll bar too, and it's just scroll bars everywhere. So lots of questions about scroll bars.
Yeah. So there's two aspects for it. So the one thing was that we tried to make the new UI such that first of all, it's now a fixed pane UI, so you don't scroll the entire page. So that's one of the ways how we try to do less scrolling, that you don't need it, that you actually only scroll now the content in the middle that you want to scroll. And so this was a change now where you suddenly don't see the scroll bar where you saw it before, but you saw it in a different place. One of the challenges with that is that there is not really good browser support. So browsers want to show their own scroll bars, and so we had to do a lot of functionality to make sure that the browser never shows its own scroll bars. And what people saw at the beginning, but it should be much, much better now, is that every now and then we were off literally by 1 pixel where we calculated the height or the width of something by just 1 pixel or 2 pixels wrong, and immediately when we do it, the browser shows a scroll bar. And so this is, and I know that we had a bunch of bugs before we launched it, and we found even some after we launched it, but we fixed them, that this shouldn't really happen any longer, that you have especially this mix of Gmail-specific scroll bars and generic browser scroll bars. And then if there's something left, we will definitely fix it right away. But again, it's a tricky thing to get right because browsers want to keep this control. They're not made for giving this control to the application itself. And then the scroll bars itself, again, we wanted to make the scroll bars less prominent because we could see that most people actually don't scroll through the UI by dragging scroll bars up and down or by pointing to the arrows up and down. That's why we sort of de-emphasize this a little bit. Most people use either arrow keys or use their mouse wheel or use other means to scroll through. But for the people who want it, it's still there. And there again, we try to do this thing again that it's not too much in your face, but if you hover over it, and after a while, you know where the scroll bars are, even if they're not too clearly visible. You know where they are. You go with your mouse there, and then they pop out. Now you can see them, and now you can use them. And the arrow keys, it's again, that's an element that we could see that was just almost never used. Very few people used it. You can do it either with the scroll bar or you can do it with the arrows. That's what we saw.
Sorry, Mark, you said arrow keys. You mean the arrows on the actual scroll bar, right?
Yeah, sorry, not the arrow keys, the arrow icons, right?
Okay, maybe just a comment about the complexity on the left side too, which was the first question, 14, about all that stuff over there.
That's something that we definitely still iterate over, that we look over, because that's an element that we never had before. Again, that was something that we had to create because we didn't want the main page to scroll any longer. So we wanted the frame to stay in the browser all the time. And this is an element, yeah, where we see ourselves like it is not perfect. So this is an element where we probably will continue to make changes to make it better and easier to use. Right now, the main problem seems to be is that the capabilities of these elements are too complex for users. That many people say, oh, I can't do this and I can't do this. And then if you explain it to them, oh no, you can actually do it. You can drag this bar on the left around. You can drag it up or down, and then it stays there. People usually get to the layout and to the look that they want to have, but it seems to be as if it's too complex to learn. So this is definitely something that we will keep iterating over.
Brett, are there any other follow-up questions around the scroll bars or the navigation? If there aren't, I think maybe we should wrap up in a second because I think we've covered most of the top questions. But I wanted to give you a chance to add any other questions either about that or maybe any other questions you want to ask.
Well, I guess if I can go off of the moderator list for just 1 second before we wrap up here, maybe I could ask you to just give a one-paragraph discussion about sorting in Gmail, because that's still asked for a lot, and people don't feel they're being heard. So maybe just some comment on sorting, even though that isn't specifically a New Look issue.
Okay, I'll let you get away with it. So yeah, sorting in Gmail, it's across all the different features, all the priorities that we have. It's not a top priority. And it's also what we try to do with Gmail. We try to create a product with, we started this with Priority Inbox, with searching and with many, many other things, where we try really, really hard that what you want to see is basically on the screen, that you don't have to do things like sorting. And so with these two things said, like it's not something that we actively work on, that we try to address. I mean, the underlying use case we try to address actually differently in Gmail.
Like, let's say, Mark, for example, if you wanted to sort your mail by sender or something, like what's the solution for that in Gmail instead?
So what we see when we do these user studies, when people want to sort by sender, they look for mails from a specific sender. They're usually not interested in seeing the senders like Sarah and Brad sort of alphabetically listed. They know if I sort by sender, now I know where I find all the mails from Sarah. And that's what we try to make also with the new UI improvements to how we do search, that you can actually type from Sarah and then you see all the mails from Sarah. These are the predominant use cases for actually sorting, not so much that people want to see it in the sorted list, but to find things. And so we just try to address this differently in Gmail.
Brett, does that cover the question?
We'll have to see what the response is on the forums.
I know that you will keep asking for it, Brett. And again, it's one of the things. It's not that we absolutely don't want to do it. That's where it really comes in. Running a product as big and as much use as Gmail, there is lots of prioritizations that we have to make and to decide what do we focus on, what do we improve, and what can't we just do. And this is just one of the things that is not at the top of the list.
Okay, well, with that, I guess we should wrap up. So thank you very much, Brett, for coming in, asking these questions, and thanks, Mark, for answering them, and thanks to all the people who submitted the questions and voted on them.
Okay, well, thank you too. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody.
Bye.